All right, let's dive into the fascinating and honestly pretty contradictory world of international trade. You always hear economists talking about how great free trade is, but if you look around, you realize it's kind of a myth. It doesn't really exist in its pure form, and that begs a really big question.
Right? It's the central paradox. We're told that open markets are the key to prosperity for everyone, yet pretty much every single country puts up some kind of barrier. So why? Well, the answer is messy, and it touches on everything from your job to your national identity.
I mean, just think about Hollywood. A movie like The Lord of the Rings is a global monster, right? It makes billions of dollars all over the world. But some governments see that, and they don't just see a great movie, they see a threat. They worry that their own filmmakers, their own stories, their own actors are just going to get drowned out. They worry that the values in these huge blockbusters will start to replace their own traditional culture. And that fear, that's a powerful, powerful reason to start putting up walls.
So to really get our heads around this, we need to break down why governments step in. And it really boils down to three big motivators: pure political power, getting an economic advantage, and protecting cultural identity. Let's kick things off with politics.
Look, at the end of the day, all those fancy economic textbooks on trade theory, they often get tossed out the window because of a much more powerful force: domestic politics. Politicians, they need to keep voters happy if they want to stay in office. And that means looking out for key groups back home, which shapes trade policy way more than any economic model.
The number one reason, the one that gets people really emotional, is protecting jobs. Nothing can bring down a government faster than high unemployment. So if cheap imports are getting the blame for factories closing, you can bet politicians are going to act. Then, of course, there's national security. It's just common sense, right? You need to be able to make your own weapons or have your own fuel supply in case a war breaks out. We also see the classic "they're not playing fair" argument, where countries hit back against each other's barriers. And finally, yeah, big countries absolutely use trade as a carrot or a stick to get smaller nations to do what they want.
Okay, so beyond just winning votes, governments also intervene to give their own economies a strategic leg up on the competition.
Now, the logic behind these is actually pretty interesting. The infant industry argument is kind of like protecting a tiny seedling in a garden. The idea is you have to shield a brand new industry from the big, established foreign companies for a while, just until it's strong enough to compete on its own. The other idea, strategic trade policy, is way more aggressive. It's about the government actively helping a domestic company become the first and the biggest in a new global industry. Think about how South Korea helped its shipbuilders. Once you're the first mover, you get huge economies of scale, meaning the more you produce, the cheaper each unit gets, and then it's almost impossible for anyone else to catch up.
And that brings us to the third big driver, which is maybe the most personal one of all. It's the simple desire to protect a nation's unique way of life.
And this quote just says it all, doesn't it? France is legendary for fiercely protecting its culture. It's actually illegal there to use many foreign language words in business if there's a French alternative. So no popcorn at Le Cinéma, you have to have maïs soufflé. French radio stations also have to play a certain percentage of French music. See, this isn't about economics at all. It's about holding on to a national identity when you're being flooded by global culture.
So that's the why. But how do governments actually do this stuff? Let's open up the trade policy toolbox and see what tools they're working with.
Okay, the first tool, the classic, the one everyone's heard of, is the tariff. It's super simple. It's just a tax you slop on a product when it gets imported. The goals are pretty clear. Make the foreign stuff more expensive so your local producers have a better chance. And, especially for developing countries, it's a great way to raise money for the government.
But governments can get pretty creative here. Check this out. This shows something called a tariff quota. The way it works is, for let's say the first 1,000 tons of a product you import, you pay a really low tariff, maybe 10%. But the second you go over that limit, that quota, bam, the tariff shoots up to something crazy like 80%. It's a really clever way to let some cheap competition in, but slam the door before imports can totally flood your market.
Now, the second major tool is the quota. And unlike a tariff, which is a tax, a quota is a hard limit. It's the government saying you can only bring in this many cars or this many tons of sugar, and that is it. Once you hit the number, no more can come in.
So let's put these two side by side because getting the difference is key. A tariff is a tax. It directly makes imports more expensive, and the government gets to collect that tax revenue. A quota is a physical limit on quantity. It makes imports more scarce, which also drives up the price, but the government doesn't get any money from it. So two different tools, but they're often aiming for the same result: protecting local industries, usually by making you, the consumer, pay more.
So beyond those big two, governments have a few other, let's call them sticks, they can use. An embargo is the nuclear option, a total ban on all trade, usually for big political reasons, like the US embargo on Cuba. But others are way more subtle, like laws requiring a certain percentage of a product to be made with local parts, or just creating a nightmare of bureaucratic red tape at customs to slow things down.
But hey, it's not all about blocking stuff. Governments also use carrots to actively promote their own exports. They'll give out subsidies, which is just a fancy word for financial help, like cash or tax breaks, to their own companies to help them compete. They offer special low-cost loans to make it easier to sell overseas. And they even set up these special foreign trade zones where the taxes are lower to encourage more business.
So think about it. You've got all these different nations, each with their own reasons for fiddling with trade, and each with a whole toolbox of methods to do it. You can just imagine the potential for absolute chaos, right? Which is exactly why, over the last century, the world has tried to build a global rulebook to manage all of this.
And if you ever wonder why we needed a global system, you just have to look back to the 1930s. The US passed a law called the Smoot-Hawley Act, and it raised tariffs through the roof. Well, other countries immediately retaliated with their own tariffs, and what followed was a complete disaster, a global trade war that basically shut down international commerce and made the Great Depression so much worse. It was a brutal lesson learned the hard way. So after World War II, the world's leaders got together and said, okay, let's never ever do that again. They created something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. And as you can see from this timeline, it started small back in '47, really just focused on lowering tariffs. But over the decades, through these big negotiating rounds, it got more and more ambitious. The Kennedy Round added rules against dumping. That's when a country sells goods abroad for less than it costs to make them. Each round added another layer to the rulebook, making it more and more comprehensive.
So did it work? Oh yeah, big time. Just look at this number. Between 1947 and 1988, GATT was incredibly successful at getting countries to slash their average tariffs on goods from a staggering 40% all the way down to just 5%. It really kicked off a golden age of global trade.
But by the 1990s, the global economy was just so much more complex. GATT wasn't really enough to handle it anymore. So in that final huge negotiation, the Uruguay round, they decided to create a successor, a true international organization, the World Trade Organization, or WTO, which officially opened for business in 1995.
The WTO basically took GATT's mission and put it on steroids. You can boil its job down to three main things: keep working to help trade flow freely, provide a place for countries to negotiate new deals to open markets even further, and, this is the big one, to act as a referee and settle trade fights between its members.
And that's what really gives the WTO its power. This quote says it all. See, under the old GATT system, countries could pretty much just ignore the rulings if they wanted to. But the WTO has a real enforcement system. If it rules that a country broke the rules, it can authorize the winning country to hit back with its own tariffs. That power to enforce decisions with real financial pain, that's why it's called the spine of the whole system.
And that really brings us full circle, doesn't it? We have this powerful global referee, the WTO, trying to enforce the rules. But we still live in a world where every single nation is trying to get an edge for its own political, economic, or cultural reasons. So the big question remains, can one set of rules, even with a strong ref, ever truly create a level playing field when everyone is still playing for their home team? It's a question that's going to define our global economy for a long time to come. Thanks for exploring it with me.